I hope you feel historically enlightened again today. Okay, we are going to go right into the message in the book of Genesis. We are in Genesis chapter 41. We're at the point in Joseph's life, Joseph, son of Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham. We are in the point in Joseph's life where things begin to speed up. They've been, kind of on this type of track, since we've been studying Joseph, it's been like this. And he's in a dungeon now. He's in a dungeon. And today we start to see that it is not a slow slope up. This is like a rocket taking off. That's what his life was like. It was like this slow descent, got stuck in a dungeon, was in the dungeon for at least a couple years, probably 3 or 4, and then ends up just boom, his life takes off in an amazing way. Everything changes. And so it's a reminder to us that God is able to redeem our circumstance so quickly it makes our head spin. Never give up hope. God can always redeem our circumstance. So today, as we are looking at Genesis chapter 41, I want to talk about the fact that God directs the courses of nations. Remember, with Nebuchadnezzar, God gave him a dream that Daniel had to interpret. Not only interpret, he had to know the dream. He had to get that from God, what the dream was. And it directed, it shared what the course of history was going to be for, hundreds of years. And that was, in fact, throughout the end of the age, because it revealed the Christ and what he would be doing after he came. And so that dream was given to a pagan king. Think about it. That revelation of world history and the Messiah came to a pagan king. And God had one of his people there to interpret. Well, we have virtually the same type of situation today, but it's not about the Messiah. It's not about world history. It's about the immediate history of Egypt and God's plan to save it. And along the way, to save a whole bunch of other people. So today, I've entitled today's message, God's Provision for a Heathen King. Because Pharaoh was clearly a heathen king. He was the king of Egypt. And he had so many false gods, you'd have a hard time keeping track of them all. There's just that many. And yet, God spoke to him about the future of his country and made provision for him in the person of a guy named Joseph. And if you think about Joseph's life, and if you think about what he did for Egypt, can you imagine how different Egypt's history would be if Joseph had not been there? This is Joseph's life, heading down to the dungeon. He thinks everything's miserable, and this is God intersecting Joseph's life at just the right moment so that Egypt would be saved. And more than Egypt, the Messianic line living in Canaan. That's God's purposes and plans. And Joseph, of course, could not see that from the dungeon. How can you possibly see it from the dungeon? However, that doesn't mean it wasn't what God was doing. So we are in Genesis 41 today. And what we have seen is that God has already been setting Joseph up. Joseph is in the dungeon because he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to seduce her, and she was actually the opposite. But she was a woman scorned, and she ended up attacking him, falsely accusing him. Potiphar clearly didn't believe that Joseph was as guilty as she said he was, because he should have been executed, but instead he was put into the prison that Potiphar was in charge of as the captain of the royal guard, and very quickly he became the lead guy in that prison. So, but to be a lead guy in the prison you're still in the prison, and that's where he was stuck for a number of years. Now, God had sent Pharaoh had an issue with 2 of his high officials, the chief of the cupbearers and the chief of the bakers, and they had dreams. We studied this last week. And Joseph correctly interpreted the dreams. And he told the chief cupbearer, you're going to be restored to your position. He told the chief of the bakers, 3 days from now you're getting executed. And it came about exactly as he said. That's where we left things. Joseph had asked the cupbearer, remember me before Pharaoh, and it clearly says he forgot. And Joseph was stuck. And this is where we pick up today in Genesis 41:1. After fully 2 years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Notably, he was standing by the branches of the lower Nile. Okay, so now we pick up, Pharaoh has a dream. And we think to ourselves, we know someone who interprets dreams. But now how's this going to work out, right? So 2 years go by. And from Joseph's perspective, no end in sight. I mean, he just does, I'm stuck here. How am I going to get out? My opportunity was these two guys, and the guy that survived was supposed to help me, and he didn't. So now what? We're going to have some more dreams? Or are we going to have what other opportunities are going to be, happen so that I can get out of this prison? So from his perspective, he woke up this morning after Pharaoh's dreams. He woke up on that morning saying, just another day in the prison. And he looked to all of his chores just like normal. But God was moving on his behalf. Joseph couldn't see it. By the way, that's the way we are. We don't always see when God's about to move in our lives in a spectacular way. And we can be we're looking right here, or if we're depressed, we're looking down there. And God can instantly redeem our circumstance and change things around in such a sudden fashion that we can get whiplash. Spiritual whiplash because of the fact that he is moving so quickly. So for Joseph, this was a no end in sight situation, and right then is when the Lord began to move on everyone's behalf. On the behalf of Egypt, on behalf of Joseph, on behalf of the family back in Canaan, on behalf of the promised Messiah who would bless the world. That's us. He was moving on our behalf here too. So, that all was in play as Pharaoh had a dream. By the way, God then, in order to preserve the messianic line, in order for us to be the beneficiaries of that Messiah through his suffering and death, and his Holy Spirit drawing to him, in order to do that, God moves on a heathen king. I mean, you know how important this dream was in world history? It was extremely important. This has more hanging on it than we can probably even track right now. We won't know exactly until we are with the Lord in his presence one day, watching the videos. They'll probably be three-dimensional. Watching the videos of our lives in, full color. But we will see just how much hung on just this night. And the Lord is moving, and he's sending dreams to Pharaoh. Okay. Now, by the way, this is bonus Sunday. Ready? This is Grammar Sunday. Doesn't that sound awesome? Grammar Sunday. Yeah. Now, by the way, I'm at least excited about it. Let me tell you why. There is a little particle called hine in Hebrew. By the way, it reads from right to left. That little particle, if you read older translations, it shows up as behold, right? You'll see it again and again. Behold, okay? However, behold is boring. Behold doesn't take into the context of what is exactly going on. And so what happens is when I come across the word behold, which it shows up again and again, by the way, it communicates that there's something special going on that we're supposed to focus on. However, what is special about it, we learn from the context. And so when I come across the word behold, I'll translate it, and notably is the hine today. Okay? And usually that's how I'll translate it. I'll translate it at the beginning of the sentence, just like where it usually is, and then with a comma. And notably, why? That's what we're being told. Hey, pay attention to this, okay? And so just notably, pay attention. You'll see it again and again show up today because this is God moving. There's major events. The behold is there because it is all significant. It is all important. This is the stuff that's going to move history. So anyway, just wanted to share that. And when I translate it, I always try to translate it, according to the context. What's the best way to translate? And I'll show you a couple times throughout today. Significantly, what word do you think that is? Oh yeah, Hine, behold. Significantly, this is his dream, 7 cows came up out of the river. They had a well-proportioned appearance, and their flesh was fat. They began to graze among the reeds. Then, ominously, Hine, 7 other cows came up out of the river, not our river, out of the river, after them. They had an evil appearance, and their flesh was emaciated. They stood beside the first cows on the bank of the river. Then the evil-looking cows with emaciated flesh ate the 7 good-looking and fat cows. At that point, Pharaoh woke up. This is gruesome. Someone asked me today if we are past all the sordid stuff in Genesis. Now we're into the gruesome. We've gone from sordid to gruesome. Okay, these are 7 really good-looking animals, okay? I mean, you're thinking to yourself, the ribeyes from these animals would be incredible. Okay, that's what this is saying, okay? Amazing-looking animals come out of the river. He's standing at the lower Nile, which is the North Nile, comes downhill lower. And so it is, they are, he's standing there. These cows come up, and he's thinking to himself, that's what I'm having for dinner tonight. Okay, he's thinking, this is good. And then, this is where the music shifts. If you were making a movie about this, you'd shift the background music to become something more dramatic, more ominous, it's because these next cows that come up are nasty, evil in appearance, emaciated, and they're just nasty. And then they get into cannibalism. And they eat the other animals. So it's 7 awful-looking animals, and they consume the others. Now, we don't learn this until Pharaoh later explains his dream, but when he explains it, he says the really awful-looking animals ate the good animals, and they still look just as awful, just as emaciated. No change. And so that's not good. It says he woke up. I bet he woke up. He's thinking to himself, that was a bizarre dream. Okay, now God's trying to communicate with him, and so he sends a second dream. He fell asleep and had a second dream. Of note, Hine, 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk. They were full and good-looking. After that, ominously, Hine, 7 heads of grain grew up after them. They were shriveled and withered by the east wind. The 7 shriveled heads of grain gulped down the 7 ample and fully formed heads of grain. Right then Pharaoh woke up, and to his surprise, Hine, it was a dream. Okay. I told you there's a lot of Hines in this section because it's just everything about this is significant. It's notable. It's surprising. It's ominous. Those are all good ways to translate the word. Anyway, so Pharaoh goes back to sleep, and now he's got 7 good-looking heads of grain. Yeah, a lot of translations will say ears of grain. Ears is something that comes to us from, the United States. We think of ears as big, full form. But it's talking about grain, so it's heads of grain. And so it's 7 heads of grain are on a stalk, and there's 7 really good-looking ones. Now, this one doesn't really get my taste buds stirred up. Because it doesn't matter if they're full grain, heads of grain or medium heads of grain, they're still going to be ground up into flour. However, the guys that are in charge of the treasury, they like it when they're big, full heads of grain because you make a lot of flour from that, and then you can make bread and all of that. So they were full heads and good looking, but then we got 7 other heads of grain that grew up after them, shriveled and withered by the east wind, the Sirocco wind that hits Egypt. Just sucks the life out of things. And so they they ate them. Same thing. Now, how did grain eat grain? Who knows? Okay, who knows? It's just a dream. So right after that, Pharaoh woke up, and to his surprise, it was a dream. Here's that thing. Hene, behold, it was a dream. What that's communicating is that Pharaoh woke up and went, oh, good thing it was a dream. It was that vivid. That's the surprise he's feeling. It's vivid. And so it's something that he lived in. He wasn't going to forget this dream. If you've ever had a dream like that where it's so vivid. Well, no, I'm not going to get into that. Anyway, too many stories can make this go pretty long. But sometimes there's been vivid dreams. And you wake up and you think, where was I? Where was I? Okay, you think you were there. So anyway, his surprise shows the vivid nature. And so he's very concerned about these dreams. I mean, again, ominous. It was clearly ominous. When you look at these things that happened, good-looking animals consumed by the evil-looking animals, good-looking grain consumed by the evil-looking grain. Now, the only surprise to me is that Pharaoh's interpreters, couldn't get a handle on what it might mean. But it was blocked from them. And sometimes, just because of the fact we have the Spirit of God, as we look at something like this, we go, why couldn't they get it? And it's because culturally, it just didn't make sense to them. We've been trained in the art of interpretation by the Bible itself, as we've learned how God communicates. So when morning arrived, his spirit was agitated. So he sent word and called all the priestly magicians of Egypt and all the wise men. Then Pharaoh related his dream to them, but no one could interpret them for Pharaoh. Okay, now, by the way, they had dedicated dream interpreters, and the priestly magicians, they'd be a part of that caste of workers. So these were the experts in dream interpretation, the wise men, experts in dream interpretation that he was calling to his side. Because he was troubled. And you've had dreams like that. I've had dreams like that. You're troubled. You say, I need to really lock down on what this means. So he sent word and he called all the priestly magicians. Now that was their priestly caste. And these were the guys that later on with Moses were able to duplicate the first plagues. So they weren't just priests, they were also those who dabbled in occult arts, magic. And they were able to get some power as a result. Never think that those who worshipped idols didn't have real occultic power. They did. Not at the same level as the miracles of God. That's clearly the message of the Exodus from Egypt. But they certainly had some occult power as they learned the tricks of the trade as the demons demonstrated it to them. There was a monograph written by one of the early church fathers that said, "Why have the idols fallen silent?" Because the idols used to speak. Not the idols, but the acolytes around the idols would fall into visions and trances. And wherever Christ went, the message of Christ was preached and his authority was proclaimed, the idols would fall silent. They no longer had that impact. Why? Because Christianity changes things. Christianity takes authority. Christianity drives out the darkness. No keys of the kingdom given yet until Christ won it for us on the cross. And so these guys still had power. And so he calls them, and he especially wants the guys that are good for interpreting dreams. So he calls the priestly magicians, and he called the wise men. Every culture had wise men. Okay? These were kind of like a precursor to the Magi. In Nebuchadnezzar's time, Daniel became the head of the Magi, the wise men of Babylon. And then later on, the Magi were still around. They're the ones that showed up. We've already talked about them. They'll be showing up right over, not here, but, originally they showed up at the house where Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were staying. And they were the remnants of the Magi, the wise men of Parthia. That's where they were now, but that remnants of the Babylonian Magi. And of course, Daniel had taught them about some things along the way, what they should be looking for. So he called his wise men, he told them the dream, but there was no interpretation. Nothing. Now, by the way, these guys were under pressure. You're getting paid to have the answers. And when they didn't have the answers, that had to be a very difficult thing. You think about how disappointed he was. Now, next week, we're going to see Pharaoh elevate Joseph, and you're going to realize, his entire official cadre had no power. They had no ability to help him at this critical time, and that had certainly something to do with the fact that he elevated Joseph, because Joseph had the answers. Okay, so we're going to see how God gets Joseph into the presence. You know, think about the dichotomy of this. Think about this. Pharaoh, the most he was considered a god in Egypt. He was like way up here. And now Joseph's about as low as you can go. He's in a dungeon. This is a big gap. And so how do you get Joseph into the presence of Pharaoh to interpret this dream? Aha! 2 years earlier, the chief of the cupbearers had been in that same prison. God had set it all up. The chief of the cupbearers spoke to Pharaoh and said, "Today I myself have cause to remember my offenses." Pharaoh was incensed with his servants, and he put me in confinement in the house of the captain of the royal guards, both me and the chief of the bakers. We dreamed a dream on the same night, he and I. We each dreamed his own dream with its own interpretation. A Hebrew young man was there with us, a servant to the captain of the royal guard. We made the dreams known to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. He interpreted for each man according to his dream. And so the chief cupbearer has his moment, right? And he is able to finally remember Joseph to Pharaoh. That was Joseph's request. Remember me to Pharaoh. I'm not supposed to be here. I was kidnapped from my home country. I didn't do anything deserved to be put into this dungeon. And it says he forgot. Now he remembers. And he was asked to remember him before Pharaoh. And that's exactly what he's doing right here. The chief cupbearer remembers. He remembers that he had made Pharaoh angry. He remembers the whole story, tells it to Pharaoh, and he remembers Joseph to Pharaoh and identifies Joseph as an interpreter of dreams. What does Pharaoh need right now? He's got an agitated spirit. Now, do you know what an agitated spirit means? It means he's got an agitated spirit. He's like, he's beside himself. He's got to know what this dream means. He knows it's significant. He thinks it's bad. He just needs to try to figure it out so that he can have some level of peace. They believed in dreams, by the way. That's why he had dream interpreters on the court. I mean, they thought dreams were extremely serious. It wasn't like in the United States today. Someone who's in leadership position has a dream, and they say, "Man, that was weird pizza." That's been stolen from many people in the United States because of the religious spirit. Okay, it's one of the biggest things we fight in the United States, is people who will take all of the wonderful, miraculous things of the Bible, and they say, none of that happens anymore. And you think to yourself, that's weird. It happened in the New Testament. It happened beyond the Bible writings. It happened into the first generation of Christianity. You know when it all ended? It ended right about the time Christianity became the religion of the empire. Because Christianity became the thing you needed to do, whether you believed or not, and the empire and the Christianity was flooded by people who had no relationship with Jesus Christ. And as a result, the miraculous disappeared. And then they made a theology around it to protect why we don't have the miraculous today. And that theology has been sold to generation after generation after generation. By the way, there was always a believing remnant. There's always been down through history those who have been the remnant, who have believed in the supernatural power of God. The thing is, Fox's Book of Martyrs is about them. They are persecuted and killed by the non-believing church. And that's been the history of things. So thank God we don't have that. Churches, the religions don't have that level of power right now, and if they try to do that, they end up, obviously we say that's not how it's done. They might still do it, but that's not how it's done. So Joseph is ready to step into the position, and it turned out that it happened just as he interpreted for us. This is the cupbearer still speaking. Pharaoh returned me to my position, but hanged him. Now, this gets Pharaoh's attention. So Pharaoh sent word and called for Joseph. They brought him quickly from the dungeon. He shaved and changed his clothes. Then he came before Pharaoh. Now, that's quick turnaround. Now, by the way, you already see the chief cupbearer is not saying to Pharaoh, you restored me to my position, you hanged the chief baker. He said Pharaoh. It's in the third person. Actually, it's just a pronoun. He, meaning the Pharaoh at the time, which was the guy probably sitting in front of him, you just never address Pharaoh as you. You always referred to him in the third person. Joseph does exactly the same thing. And so now, that's what he says. It turned out that it happened just as he interpreted for us. Pharaoh returned me to my position, but hanged him. Okay, so, but it's he. And I just put in the antecedent. So now Pharaoh wants Joseph to be there quickly, and that means people are running. People are using, I don't know how far away the dungeon was, but they were moving quickly to make sure that Pharaoh's demand came very quickly. So the chief of the cupbearers is saying, exactly as he said. Pharaoh's like, I need this guy. Okay, so they quick run and get him. And they make him presentable. Hebrews didn't shave. Egyptians did. And they would shave their whole head. So when they say they shaved Joseph, they probably took off every bit of hair on his head. Okay? They might have given him a wig, but they really didn't have time for that. So when he got shaved, he got shaved. Okay? And I'm not sure if they kept his eyebrows or not. So, I mean, yeah, this is shaved. This is, you look at those old pictures of the Egyptian pharaohs and leaders. It's like, ooh, yeah, okay. So, watch The Prince of Egypt. There's some scenes where they're being, those ceremonial wigs are being put on them rather hilariously. So anyway, they made him presentable. They changed clothes. They probably threw some water on him, unless he had showered that morning. You never know. He was the head of the prison. He probably could, make sure that he stayed somewhat clean, but he certainly wasn't going to come before Pharaoh in prison clothes. And so they quickly got him some clothing to put on that was appropriate in Pharaoh's presence. They shaved him, he had to be prepared for Pharaoh's presence, and they got him into his presence. So they got him there. You can imagine. They did this. They ran up to the door, and they said, okay. They opened the doors and walked in a very stately manner, because that's what you do, okay? And they walk into Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, but there is no interpretation of it. I myself have heard about you. It is reported that you hear a dream and can interpret it. Joseph responded to Pharaoh, saying, it is not me, but God that will give Pharaoh a beneficial answer. Okay, that's Joseph's response, but okay. I have dreams, but I have no interpretation. That's why you're here. And, there's some implications to this. If you do okay, things could go well with you. Whenever you're before Pharaoh, you want to do good, right? So, Joseph had faith, by the way. Really, Joseph had faith. He had faith that God had brought him there for this purpose. And so he wasn't even concerned about an interpretation. Joseph wasn't dumb. He's standing before Pharaoh. You understand, dungeon, Pharaoh. An hour and a half earlier, he was having breakfast in the dungeon. And now he's in front of the big guy. And he knows this is the Lord. There's no other way to explain this. And so he's got this faith that God's going to make it work out. So Pharaoh reports what he said, and then Joseph says very quickly, it's not me, but God that will give the interpretation, and it'll be a beneficial interpretation. That's his faith. He's absolutely certain that God has put him in this position for a reason. So he says, you're going to get you understand? He's telling the big guy, the monarch, the one who has the power of life and death. We've already seen the chief of the bakers find that out personally. He's got, you want to tick him off? After Joseph said this, say, I have no idea. I don't think he'd have been going back to the dungeon. I think he'd have been going to the graveyard. Okay? So anyway, but Joseph is absolutely confident here. He says, it's not me, but God. Don't get into this, we'll see Joseph kind of shocked Pharaoh. No, this is one sentence. He says it very quickly. He's just being a little deferential, giving glory to God instead of to himself. But he says right away in one sentence, he doesn't give Pharaoh a chance to get angry or to be upset or to be disappointed. He simply says, by the way, Pharaoh, it's not me, it's God, but you're going to get a good answer. Okay? He's wise. He's not giving Pharaoh a chance to throw him out. This is a smart cookie. Okay? He knows what he's doing because God has prepared him through all of the stuff he's gone through. Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, "In my dream, notably, Heathen, I was standing on the bank of the lower Nile. Then unexpectedly, Heathen, 7 cows came up from the Nile, which had a well-proportioned appearance, and their flesh was fat. They began to graze among the reeds. After that, ominously, Heathen, 7 cows came up after them. They were weak, very evil in appearance, and their flesh was emaciated. I have not seen in all the land of Egypt such worthless animals as these." Then the emaciated and evil-looking cows ate the 7 first cows, the fat ones. But when they had gone into their bellies, it was not apparent that they had gone into their bellies. Their appearance was just as evil as it was in the beginning. Then I woke up. I also looked in my dream, and significantly 7 heads of grain came up from the same stalk. They were full and good-looking. Then ominously, Heathen, 7 heads of grain grew up after them that were dried up, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. The shriveled heads of grain gulped down the 7 good heads of grain. I shared this with the priestly magicians, but no one could provide an explanation to me. Okay, now he tells the same story. We've already read this once. However, he adds some details. That's the details of, they put them in their bellies, but they didn't look like they were full. They were still just as emaciated. And by the way, his commentary, I have never seen animals that look this bad. I mean, you understand? He's adding his own commentary because that's how impacted he is. He's like, these things were, they were ugly. Ugly. Okay? So, and he said, the grain did exactly the same thing. He even says a little bit more about the grain. They were dried up, shriveled, and withered. I mean, he adds even a third term. And he says, and I shared it with my team, but my team didn't have an interpretation. And so now Joseph has an opportunity. The cows ate, no change of appearance. The heads of grain, they were ugly, but we don't hear they didn't have a change of appearance, but you can assume that that's exactly what had happened, or that would have been mentioned. And no one understands this dream, so I need some help. And again, because we're so trained in biblical interpretation, just through the parables, if nothing else, to us it's like, I think I can get some ideas here. But apparently the interpreters of Pharaoh didn't have a clue. Now listen to the confidence that Joseph has. Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dream of Pharaoh is one. It is declaring to Pharaoh what God is preparing. The 7 good-looking cows are 7 years, and the 7 good-looking heads of grain are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 emaciated and evil-looking cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 shriveled heads of grain that were withered by the east wind are 7 years of famine. It is the thing that I have spoken to Pharaoh, which God has made known to Pharaoh. Look, 7 years of great prosperity are coming in all the land of Egypt. 7 years of famine will arise after them. All the prosperity of the land of Egypt will be forgotten as the famine devours the land. The prosperity will not be remembered in the land before the face of the famine after it, for it will be very oppressive." Just imagine Pharaoh's face. He's like, and by the way, he knows it's true. As he's hearing it, he knows it's true. And because it's witnessing to his spirit. I told you recently I had to do a dream interpretation for someone, and it was a pretty complex interpretation, and it was about an international ministry stream, and there were all sorts of moving parts in it. And as soon as I looked at it, I knew exactly what it meant. I interpret a lot of dreams. Interpretation is from the Lord. The Lord needed this organization to have an interpretation, and so it was brought to me, and I know exactly how this works the way that Joseph got it, because I've had this happen again and again, and here again, the one that was brought to me was of significance because it was for an international organization that needed to know what it was that God was saying. And I want you to pay attention to that, because in a lot of places, they'd wake up and say, that's weird, must have had pizza. And miss entirely, because that's how ill-trained we can become, and miss entirely what it is that God is, the God of the universe is trying to help. And then the thing crashes and burns because no one listens to him. And we say, look what God allowed to happen. No, God didn't allow that to happen. You did that all on your own. God's always trying to help. You know, whenever I see a natural disaster and someone says, where was God? And I know my response. It's always the same. God was trying to talk to someone who didn't step into the gap, rolled over after they woke up at night when he was talking to them, and they ignored their job to pray for that particular area. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I have to ask you a question. Read my book. Most of you have. We give it away free on Sunday mornings. You know, whatever you bind on earth. But at least you have it in your bookshelf just looking nice, if nothing else. But in that book, we have a story of when God spoke to us and we paid attention. And because of that, our area was preserved from great harm. He spoke in a series of dreams, and it was because when I got the first dream, and it wasn't even that detailed, but I knew what it was about, and I said, God, I need more information if this is from you. I paid attention to the dream. I said, Lord, I believe it's from you, but I'm going to need a lot more information than this. And he responded because I cared. Because I believe God spoke in dreams. If I didn't believe God spoke in dreams, I'd have rolled over and gone back to sleep. And then unless he was able to rouse someone else, South Florida would have been hit by a Category 5 hurricane during rush hour, and it would have been by surprise a year later. And we would have said, where was God? And God would have said, you know what? I was in Cutter's bedroom, and he didn't care enough to get up and write it down and pray. You can look at any natural disaster, and when you hear that phrase, where was God? If there's a presence of believers in that nation, because you have to believe this, either that we're so special that God decided to do something he never does, or that it was just that we paid attention. And it says clearly in the Bible, he's always looking for people to stand in the gap. He's always looking for those who will intercede and pray and stand in the gap. It does not give him any pleasure when something disastrous happens. So if you look at any natural disaster and you hear people say, where was God? You say, I don't know where he was, but I know he was trying. And it was the body of Christ who failed. The people who call themselves the church, but they are so ill-trained in the area of supernatural revelation that they don't know it's God speaking. Which means they're reaping what they sow. That sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? But it's true. And I'm not saying we catch everything. There's times we go through bad stuff because we do just like everyone else. It's not because we don't have respect for the dreams or for the revelation. It's just because we miss stuff. We're human, and we miss stuff, okay? And as a result, we too pay a price and we reap what we sow. But boy, we pray and pray and pray that God would speak to us at higher and higher levels and give us more authority. And we don't wait for the hurricane seasons now for something to show up or for revelation. We're praying 4 times twice before the season even begins, and another 2 times we are praying during the month of June before anything's really spinning up, because of the fact that we want to be on top of it and praying the prayers that are necessary to stop these things before they can show up and need to be dealt with through revelation. We've got authority. We know what it is. We know we have that authority. And if we need any extra revelation, this last year, we went through it. Was it last week when I played the video? The Lord told us that there would be 5 named storms we'd have to contend with, and we didn't understand exactly what that meant. I said that, and I said, we'll find out at the end of the season if this is just talking that there'll be 5 hurricanes, named hurricanes, or, they do name tropical storms. It would seem a little bit too small of a number, but it's happened before where there were only 5 storms total. But we got to the end of the season and we saw that there were 5 named hurricanes. So we went, okay, we got that figured out. When God speaks to us about named storms, he's speaking about named hurricanes. We've learned a little bit more of how he communicates, which is good. It's a love language. You learn all the way, okay? Now if he speaks about 5 named storms, we'll say, yeah, 5 named hurricanes. Until suddenly we realize, it doesn't mean that anymore, because we keep learning, or there's nuances to it. Okay, so Joseph is giving an interpretation that is not great news to Pharaoh. Okay. However, Pharaoh's smart enough to know there's an answer to this. If I am being told this, there's a reason I'm being told this. And he's Pharaoh, and he's got the wise guys all around him, and the priestly magicians. I want to say the priestly musicians, because that was a Hebrew thing, right? That was the priests and musicians, the Levites and musicians. So, okay, God's speaking to Pharaoh about the future of Egypt, and I've already told you it impacts far more than Egypt. Okay? It impacts the promises of Messiah and the whole thing. And the cows and the grain represent 7 years. Now I want you to go back to the cupbaker's dream and the cupbearer's dream and the chief baker's dream. And so in that dream, the context was set. They had the dream, and Pharaoh's birthday was in 3 days. Well, so when the cupbearer said 3 vines showed up, and the baker said 3 baskets, and the Pharaoh, as a part of his festivities, had called all his chief officials together for the party, which would include these 2 guys. They would normally be there if they weren't in prison. It wasn't difficult for Joseph to know that the 3 baskets and the 3 vines represented the 3 days. And at that party, Pharaoh would often issue pardons or punishments. So Joseph, because of the context of what's going on, says, 3 baskets, 3 vines, in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to be issuing your verdicts, and this is the verdict for you. Boom, you're going to get restored. This is the verdict for you. You're going to get eaten by birds, executed, and they're not even going to bury you. Not a very pleasant picture, but it was true. Now we've got 7s. And I suspect that Joseph got the interpretation simply because of the grain. Yearly harvest. Okay? 7 heads of grain, 7 different harvests. Okay? The cows, they wouldn't tell you nothing. As far as timing, it was extremely necessary that Joseph got more information, and so you got 7 harvests, which means 7 years. I suspect that's where he got his clue. And when you get that kind of thing in your head, God solidifies it and makes you realize that really is the answer. And so, again, I just told you about the interpretation I just had. As soon as I said, that must mean this, I knew without any doubt that's exactly what it meant. And when I sent that interpretation in, you know what the response was? That must have come from the Lord. Okay? This interpretation, without a doubt, came from the Lord because of Joseph's. That's what happens when an interpretation for something complex happens. Everyone looks at it and goes, well, of course that's the answer. We're looking at this dream going, of course it's the answer. But guess what? Joseph had to be the first one to speak it. And he had to figure out what it meant. So the cows and the grains heads of grain represent 7 years, and it's going to be feast and famine. That's why it's the good stuff first and the bad stuff second. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Now, by the way, famine is bad. In Egypt, the Nile was their source of water to be able to bring the irrigation they needed. And if there was no rain and the Nile went down, there was no water to be able to water their crops. There is a report that in about 2600 BC, comes down to us through history, there was a major famine and in Egypt. Okay, major famine. And it may be this particular famine. It was years of famine are being mentioned. I can't quite remember how many years were in the literature I was reading, but it was a big deal, in a time frame that somewhat close. And you know how as they figure out time frames, sometimes they're a little loose. But it happened in Egypt. Bad famines happened. And it wasn't just going to be Egypt. It was going to be everywhere. And it was going to be from lack of rain. And it was going to hit Canaan, too, where the promised line was living. So, as for the repetition of the dream to Pharaoh twice, it is because the matter is settled before God, and God will act quickly to do it. Joseph, did you have any experience with two dreams? Okay. You know he did. Joseph's experience with repetition. He had the two dreams that he originally started with. The first dream was of his brothers bowing down to him. The second dream was of his family bowing down to him, his mom and dad too. And two dreams. And he knows that right after he shared those dreams, he was on his way to Egypt. And so he knows, when God doubles a dream down, things happen quickly. He knows that. That's his experience. It's a doubling. And so he knows that from his own experience, this is what happened. I had two dreams, and suddenly I'm on my way to Egypt. God's up to something. I'm now standing before Pharaoh. The doubling was something that, it took a long time for it to come all the way in, but it started on the day that his brothers sold him to the Ishmaelites, to the Midianites. And they sent him down to Egypt, and he knew that's when this path was started. And his faith every step of the ways that God was going to redeem it, and God certainly did. And so he's able to say to Pharaoh with confidence, the reason God repeated it is the same reason he repeated it to me. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. Could happen within the next harvest. We may have one of the greatest harvests. I suspect it happened. The next harvest may have been the largest harvest on record in the land of Egypt. And the next 6. And so Joseph was able to say, hey, this is going to happen, and this is starting now. Now, we don't have time today to go into all the good stuff that comes into Joseph's life as a result of this, but that's next week. All we know is God has taken Joseph out of the dungeon, put him in the presence of Pharaoh, and he's done his job. And here's the deal. You get good at interpreting dreams, you get good at understanding God's revelation, and you could be standing before kings. Now, you may have to go through some dungeons to get there. But you could be standing before kings because dream interpreters are not a dime a dozen. Okay? You know that same dream that was given to me, and God just opened it up to me? Someone else interpreted it and did it publicly. I didn't, because it was way too sensitive. I did not post it publicly to the people that had asked us for the interpretation. I posted it privately. And but someone else posted a public interpretation, and it was so far out there. And it was someone who understands interpretation. It's just that it just didn't have the key. didn't have the ability to unlock it. When you've got the ability to unlock a dream, and I'm not saying we have the ability to interpret every dream. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, but when you have the key, that is precious. And people will come to your door asking for your help. I'm probably prophesying over myself right now. Anyway, that is the message from today's scriptures. And next week, we get to see the exaltation and how God uses Joseph from here on in. So let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity for us as we step into the promises that Joseph has received from you, and now we see it coming about. We see the importance of dreams again and again. See history impacted in an amazing way. Make us those who are sensitive to what you are saying, and help us never to miss what you're trying to speak to us. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.